My uncle said he was preparing me for the real world, so I prepared the police for his arrest. Uncle Lawrence handed me the clipboard with 6 signatures on it and told me to forge the 7th. The elderly woman whose name I was supposed to copy had been dead for 3 weeks, but the refinancing paperwork needed her approval, dated from last Monday. I was 16 years old, sitting in his leased Mercedes outside a strip mall title company, and this was my 4th forgery that month. He called it business training. He said the real world required flexibility, and that college kids graduated without understanding how money actually moved. I wanted to believe him because my mom worked doubles at the hospital while he drove luxury cars and owned 3 houses. The pen felt heavy in my hand. Mrs. Calabresi's shaky signature from the previous page mocked me. I could copy it perfectly now, after weeks of practice on other documents. Uncle Lawrence checked his Rolex and said we had 8 minutes before the notary expected us. His cologne filled the car, expensive and suffocating, while he explained how this deal would net $40,000 in equity extraction that the family would never miss since they were already fighting over the estate. My hand moved across the page, muscle memory taking over, and I hated how natural it felt. The forgery started 3 months earlier when Uncle Lawrence picked me up from school in September. He said Mom told him I needed a job, and he had the perfect opportunity for someone sharp who could learn fast. His real estate investment company needed help with paperwork, client meetings, property inspections, basic stuff that paid $20 an hour cash. I jumped at it immediately, calculating how many shifts at that rate would buy the car I wanted. He took me to his office, a renovated warehouse space with exposed brick and modern furniture, where his assistant Diane sat behind a glass desk, managing multiple phones. She barely looked up when he introduced me. That first week seemed straightforward enough. I filed documents, made copies, answered calls about property listings. Uncle Lawrence would explain each transaction in detail, teaching me about mortgages, equity, investment returns, flipping houses for profit. He had this way of making everything sound inevitable, like money naturally flowed to people who understood these simple principles that schools refused to teach. By the second week, he started bringing me to property viewings. We would meet elderly homeowners, usually widows, and Uncle Lawrence would evaluate their houses while talking about reverse mortgages and accessing trapped equity to improve their retirement security. His pitch was always the same. He would sit in their living rooms, looking at family photos, asking about grandchildren, building rapport before explaining how their house could provide income without them having to move. The numbers always sounded good when he presented them. One woman, Mrs. Dorothy Nguyen, actually cried with relief when he explained she could get $30,000 to help her daughter, who was struggling after a divorce. He made it sound like he was doing them a favor, like the complexity of the paperwork and the fees were necessary evils in a system designed to keep regular people from accessing their own wealth. I watched him work, impressed by his confidence and the way people trusted him immediately. He would hand me documents to witness signatures, explaining later that witnesses added legitimacy to contracts, and I was learning valuable lessons about how business relationships developed. The money appeared in my pocket every Friday, crisp hundreds that made me feel adult and capable. Mom noticed I was helping with groceries and buying my own clothes. She hugged Uncle Lawrence at Sunday dinner and thanked him for being a good influence, for teaching me responsibility, while she worked impossible hours to keep us afloat. The first crack in the facade appeared when Uncle Lawrence asked me to backdate a document. Mrs. Nguyen's refinancing paperwork had been delayed by the title company, but Uncle Lawrence needed the origination date to be 2 weeks earlier for reasons he claimed were too technical to explain fully, something about rate locks and investor requirements. He said it happened all the time in real estate, and that the actual signing date was less important than the intent date. I hesitated for maybe 10 seconds before taking the pen. It seemed minor, a technicality that did not hurt anyone. He smiled and said I was learning fast, that most people wasted years in college learning theory while never understanding that business required practical flexibility. The document looked perfect when I finished. Diane notarized it without comment, her stamp making it official. That night, I could not sleep. The wrongness of it sat in my stomach like spoiled food, but I told myself it was just nervousness about doing something new. Uncle Lawrence paid me a $500 bonus that week. He said it was for initiative and discretion, 2 qualities that would serve me well in life. The money felt different from the hourly wages, heavier somehow, but I deposited it anyway. 2 weeks later, I saw Mrs. Nguyen at the grocery store. She was counting change at the register, putting items back because she did not have enough money to cover everything. Her hands shook as she apologized to the cashier. I stood 3 aisles away with a cart full of name-brand products, paid for with Uncle Lawrence's money, and watched this woman who supposedly had received $30,000 in refinancing struggle to buy food. Something was catastrophically wrong. I started paying attention differently after that. Uncle Lawrence would show me the contracts with their impressive numbers, but I began noticing the fine print he skimmed over. The fees that ate up huge percentages of the loan amounts, the balloon payments hidden in the terms, the adjustable rates that would spike after 6 months. These were not investment opportunities, they were traps. He was stripping equity from vulnerable people and leaving them with debt they could not afford. When I asked him about Mrs. Nguyen, he said she probably had expenses I did not know about, that her financial situation was complicated like most people's situations were. He said it with such casual certainty that I almost believed him. except I had watched her count nickels to buy bread. The forgery requests increased steadily. Uncle Lawrence would explain each one as necessary to expedite deals that were already agreed upon, just cutting through red tape that served no real purpose. A signature here because the client was traveling and had given verbal permission. A date change there because processing delays should not penalize everyone involved. An initial on a disclosure form that must have been overlooked in the original signing. He made it sound reasonable every time, framing it as efficiency rather than fraud. I started keeping copies of everything, not even sure why at first, just some instinct that I needed evidence of what was real versus what Uncle Lawrence claimed was real. I would stay late at the office, making duplicates on the copy machine while Diane was on the phone or in the bathroom. The files grew thick with contradictions, original documents that showed completely different terms from the versions Uncle Lawrence submitted to title companies and lenders. I hid everything in my bedroom closet, inside an old backpack, checking compulsively to make sure it was still there. Mom asked why I seemed distracted lately. I told her school was stressful. She squeezed my shoulder and said she was proud of how mature I was becoming, working and studying and helping out. The guilt felt like swallowing glass. Uncle Lawrence started bringing me to more high-stakes meetings. There was Raymond Kowalski, an 83-year-old veteran whose wife had died the previous year, leaving him alone in a house they had owned for 40 years. Uncle Lawrence convinced him to refinance for $70,000 by talking about medical expenses and the cost of home maintenance at his age. The paperwork was deliberately confusing, pages of legal jargon that Raymond could barely read even with his glasses. Uncle Lawrence would point to signature lines and say reassuring things about how this was standard language and everything protected Raymond's interests. I watched Raymond's arthritic hand struggle to sign, noticed how Uncle Lawrence angled the papers so Raymond could not see certain sections, observed how quickly we left once the signatures were complete. In the car afterward, Uncle Lawrence was euphoric. He explained how this deal would net us $60,000 in profit after fees and investor cuts. The word us felt like acid. I had witnessed those signatures, made copies, helped carry the paperwork. I was complicit in whatever was happening to Raymond. That night, I drove past Raymond's house. The porch light was on, illuminating peeling paint and a cracked walkway. This was a man who had survived war and built a life, now being systematically robbed by my uncle with my help. I started researching elder financial abuse online. The patterns were everywhere, matching Uncle Lawrence's methods exactly, targeting isolated seniors, building false trust, creating urgency around accessing equity, burying predatory terms in complex paperwork, rushing signatures, using multiple fees to extract maximum money while leaving victims with unsustainable debt. The website said it was epidemic, that family members were often the perpetrators, that victims rarely reported it due to shame or not understanding what happened until foreclosure notices arrived. I found statistics about seniors losing their homes, about suicide rates among elderly people facing financial catastrophe, about families destroyed when the exploitation was discovered. Every page I read showed me Uncle Lawrence's face. The business training he promised was actually criminal apprenticeship. He was teaching me how to steal from vulnerable people and disguising it as real-world education. The $20 an hour was payment for my moral flexibility. The bonuses were rewards for crossing ethical lines without question. I had been so desperate to believe I was special, that I was learning valuable secrets, that I had let myself become part of something monstrous. The backpack in my closet suddenly felt like the most important thing I owned. Confronting Uncle Lawrence seemed impossible at first. He was family, successful, confident, and connected. He had answers for everything, and a way of making criticism seem naive. But I could not keep forging signatures and watching victims struggle while pretending I did not know what I was participating in. I decided to test him with direct questions. During a meeting prep one afternoon, I asked what happened to clients after we finished their refinancing. He said they used the money however they needed, and that our job ended once the paperwork was complete. I pressed further, asking if he followed up to make sure they were okay, if the terms were working out for them. His expression shifted, friendly patience replaced with something harder. He said I was asking questions above my pay grade, that business meant focusing on our role without getting emotionally tangled in client situations. He reminded me that he was doing me a favor by providing this opportunity when I could be flipping burgers like other kids my age. The message was clear. Do not question the operation, collect your money, be grateful. That conversation told me everything I needed to know about whether Uncle Lawrence would respond to moral appeals. He knew exactly what he was doing and did not care about the consequences. My decision to go to the police was not dramatic or sudden. It grew gradually from accumulated weight, from seeing too many victims, from forging too many signatures, from lying to my mother's face too many times. I spent 2 weeks organizing the evidence, creating a timeline of transactions, matching forged documents with originals, listing victims with addresses and phone numbers. The backpack contents transformed into a prosecutable case with dates, amounts, and clear patterns of fraud. I made copies of everything and stored them in 3 different locations in case something happened to the originals. The paranoia felt justified given what I was preparing to do. Uncle Lawrence had mentioned connections with local officials, had bragged about judges he knew and politicians he donated to. I had no idea how deep his network ran or what he might do if he discovered I was documenting his crimes. I started noticing when he looked at me too long or asked questions about what I was working on. Diane seemed suspicious too, watching me when she thought I was not paying attention. I stopped staying late at the office and made excuses about school projects when Uncle Lawrence suggested additional weekend work. The distance was necessary for safety, but also made everything more tense. The breaking point came in November. Uncle Lawrence had been working on what he called his biggest deal yet, a refinancing package for Marion Fletcher, a 91-year-old woman with advanced dementia. Her daughter lived across the country and had power of attorney, but Uncle Lawrence had convinced Marion to sign documents during one of her clear moments, claiming it was routine paperwork for her existing mortgage. The daughter knew nothing about it. I was present for that signing, watched Uncle Lawrence manipulate a confused elderly woman who kept asking where her husband was, not remembering he had died 20 years earlier. He would redirect her attention, point to signature lines, guide her hand when she hesitated. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes. Afterward, he handed me the documents to make copies, while he took Marion back to her living room and turned on her television. I stood at the copy machine, shaking with rage and horror, looking at signatures obtained through exploitation of cognitive impairment. This was not a gray area or debatable ethics. This was predatory abuse of the most vulnerable person I had ever met. When Uncle Lawrence came back, he was humming, pleased with himself. He said this deal would net $80,000 and that my cut would be substantial. I asked what would happen to Marion. He said she would be fine, that she would never even know the difference. The casual cruelty of it made me physically sick. I called the police non-emergency line that evening from a gas station payphone, too paranoid to use my cell phone. The operator transferred me to the Financial Crimes Division where a detective named Robert Aldrich asked me to explain why I was calling. I gave him the summary, condensed version. My uncle was running a mortgage fraud operation targeting elderly victims. I had evidence of forged documents and predatory lending. I had participated under false pretenses, but was willing to cooperate fully. Detective Aldrich's tone changed immediately. He said this was serious, that I should not discuss it with anyone, that he would need to meet with me as soon as possible to review the evidence. We arranged a meeting for the following afternoon at a coffee shop across town where nobody would recognize me. Hanging up that phone felt like jumping off a cliff. There was no going back now. I had initiated the process that would destroy Uncle Lawrence and probably damage my relationship with my entire family. Mom idolized her brother, leaned on him for support and advice. This would devastate her. But Marion Fletcher's confused face kept appearing in my mind, and I knew I could not protect my family by enabling the victimization of other people's grandmothers. Meeting Detective Aldrich was surreal. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, wearing jeans and a polo shirt to blend in. He ordered coffee and sat across from me at a corner table, pulling out a notebook. I slid the backpack across to him. He opened it carefully, examining the contents with increasing focus. After about 10 minutes of silent review, he looked up at me with an expression I could not quite read. He said this was extensive documentation, exactly the kind of evidence that built prosecutable cases. He asked how old I was and seemed troubled when I said 16. He explained that my age complicated things legally, that any defense attorney would argue I was manipulated or coerced, which might actually be true to some extent. But he also said my cooperation and testimony would be crucial to stopping Uncle Lawrence before more people were victimized. He asked if I was prepared for the consequences, for the investigation, for the family fallout, for potentially testifying in court. I told him I had watched my uncle steal from a woman with dementia and that I could not live with being part of that. Detective Aldrich nodded slowly, closing the notebook. He said he would need to bring in federal partners since mortgage fraud crossed jurisdictional lines. He took my contact information and told me to act normal around Uncle Lawrence while the investigation proceeded. That last instruction felt impossible. Acting normal was a performance I barely managed. Uncle Lawrence noticed something was off within days. He asked if I was feeling okay, if school was overwhelming me, if the work was too much pressure. I blamed stress about upcoming exams and applications for summer programs. He seemed satisfied with that explanation, distracted by his own deals. The Marion Fletcher refinancing was processing, and he was already lining up new targets. I continued showing up for work, making copies, attending meetings, all while wearing a wire that Detective Aldrich had provided. The recording device was tiny, hidden in my jacket, capturing every conversation. Uncle Lawrence talked freely about the business when we were alone, explaining strategies and justifying methods. He admitted on tape that many of his clients did not fully understand the terms, that he structured deals to maximize his profit, even when better options existed for the homeowners, that some people would struggle with the payments, but that was their problem to solve. Every recorded word built the case against him. Diane was on the tapes too, discussing how to process documents faster, how to avoid certain scrutiny, how to keep investors happy with returns. The entire operation was documented through their own words. The investigation moved faster than I anticipated. Detective Aldrich brought in FBI agents specializing in financial fraud. They reviewed the evidence, interviewed victims, traced money flows through Uncle Lawrence's accounts, obtained warrants for business records. Within 3 weeks, they had enough for arrests. They coordinated carefully, planning to execute warrants simultaneously at Uncle Lawrence's office and home to prevent evidence destruction. They asked if I wanted warning before it happened. I said no, that I needed to be genuinely surprised, or Uncle Lawrence would suspect my involvement immediately. The morning they raided the office, I was at school taking a calculus test. My phone started buzzing around 10:30 with texts from Diane, fragmented and panicked, talking about federal agents and seized computers. I pretended to be shocked when I checked them later. Mom called me crying during lunch, saying Uncle Lawrence had been arrested and that there must be some terrible mistake. She could not believe her brother would do anything wrong. I drove to her work after school and held her while she sobbed about how the police had destroyed his office and taken him away in handcuffs. Lying to her then was the hardest thing I had ever done. The scope of Uncle Lawrence's operation emerged during the investigation. He had defrauded 43 elderly victims over 18 months, extracting over $2 million in predatory refinancing schemes. Most victims had lost or were in danger of losing their homes. Several had depleted life savings trying to make balloon payments they did not understand were coming. One man, Thomas Brennan, had died by suicide after receiving foreclosure notice, leaving a note apologizing to his children for losing their inheritance. The investigation revealed Uncle Lawrence worked with a network of corrupt notaries, title company employees, and investors who knowingly funded predatory loans for high returns. Diane was arrested as an accomplice. 2 other employees I barely knew faced charges. The whole enterprise collapsed spectacularly, making local and national news. Reporters called it elder exploitation, financial abuse, organized fraud. They interviewed victims who cried on camera about betrayal and devastation. One news segment showed Raymond Kowalski's house with a foreclosure sign on the lawn, the veteran's face aged by stress and shame. Watching that broadcast broke something inside me. These were real people whose lives Uncle Lawrence had destroyed while teaching me that success meant taking advantage of others' vulnerabilities. My involvement became public during the preliminary hearings. The prosecutor needed my testimony to establish the systematic nature of the fraud and to authenticate the documented evidence. Defense attorneys tried to discredit me, arguing I was a minor who did not understand the business, that I had stolen documents without permission, that my testimony was unreliable. The prosecutor countered by playing recordings where Uncle Lawrence explicitly explained fraudulent activities, where he admitted manipulating victims, where he instructed me to forge signatures. The courtroom went silent during those playbacks. Uncle Lawrence sat at the defense table, expensive suit and professional haircut, staring straight ahead without expression. Mom was in the gallery, her face collapsing as she heard her brother's voice discussing elderly victims as profit sources. She looked at me once during recess, hurt and confusion replacing the pride that used to be there. I wanted to explain that I was trying to stop harm, that protecting victims mattered more than protecting family who victimized people. But the court officers kept us separated. The preliminary hearing established probable cause easily. Uncle Lawrence was bound over for trial on 47 counts of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Prosecutors paraded victim after victim to the stand, each one describing trust betrayed and security destroyed. Mrs. Nguyen testified about losing her house despite making every payment she thought was required, about living with her daughter now and feeling like a burden. Raymond Kowalski cried, explaining how he had believed Uncle Lawrence genuinely wanted to help him, how the realization that he had been targeted for theft made him question every relationship in his life. Marion Fletcher's daughter testified for her mother, who was too impaired to appear, describing the shock of discovering her mother's house was being refinanced without her knowledge or consent. Expert witnesses explained the fraud mechanics, showing how Uncle Lawrence systematically targeted vulnerable seniors and structured deals to maximize extraction, while ensuring victims could not afford the terms. Financial analysts traced money flows proving Uncle Lawrence had enriched himself by millions, while victims faced ruin. The evidence was overwhelming and devastating. Defense attorneys tried arguing that Uncle Lawrence believed the deals were legitimate, that he was simply an aggressive businessman, that no one forced victims to sign anything. The prosecution countered by playing recording after recording of Uncle Lawrence admitting to manipulation, discussing strategies to confuse clients, instructing me to forge documents when real signatures could not be obtained. My testimony lasted 2 days. The prosecutor walked me through my involvement chronologically, asking me to explain how Uncle Lawrence recruited me, trained me, gradually expanded my role in the operation. I described watching him manipulate victims, witnessing the forgeries, seeing the discrepancies between what he told clients and what the actual contract terms were. The defense cross-examination was brutal. They portrayed me as a juvenile delinquent who stole from his uncle's business, who forged documents on my own initiative, who was now lying to avoid criminal responsibility myself. They pointed out that I had accepted money for my participation, that I had continued working even after suspecting something was wrong, that I could have stopped at any time but chose to continue collecting payments. Every accusation was technically true and absolutely painful to hear stated in open court. But the prosecutor's redirect was effective. She asked why I ultimately went to the police instead of simply quitting. I explained that I could not keep watching people get hurt, that I knew my testimony might be imperfect, but that staying silent meant more victims. I described Marion Fletcher's confusion and how that moment made me understand that silence was participation. The jury seemed affected by that answer, several members nodding slightly. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on all 47 counts. Uncle Lawrence showed no reaction when the jury foreperson announced it, just stared at the defense table like the words were in a foreign language. Mom cried silently in the gallery. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, remanding Uncle Lawrence to custody immediately given flight risk and the severity of conviction. Court officers led him away in handcuffs while family members who still supported him shouted about injustice and persecution. My mom left the courthouse without looking at me. I stood on the steps afterward, watching her drive away, knowing our relationship might never recover, but also knowing that 43 victims had some measure of justice. Detective Aldrich found me standing there and said I had done the right thing, that the case would not have been possible without my evidence and testimony. He said most people in my position would have just quit quietly and pretended they never knew what was happening. The validation helped slightly, but did not erase the hollowness of watching my mother drive away. Sentencing day brought a packed courtroom. The judge allowed victim impact statements before announcing the sentence. 15 people spoke about how Uncle Lawrence's fraud had destroyed their financial security, their trust in others, their ability to age with dignity. Raymond Kowalski talked about contemplating suicide when he realized he would lose his house, about the shame of admitting to his children that he had been fooled. Mrs. Nguyen described couch surfing between relatives' homes, having lost her independence entirely. Marion Fletcher's daughter read a statement about her mother's confusion when being moved to a memory care facility they could no longer afford, about explaining repeatedly to a woman with dementia why her house was gone. The cumulative weight of their testimony filled the courtroom with palpable grief. When the judge finally spoke, her voice carried steel. She said Uncle Lawrence had betrayed sacred trust, had targeted the most vulnerable members of society, had shown no remorse even when confronted with the suffering he caused. She sentenced him to 23 years in federal prison, to be followed by 10 years of supervised release. She ordered full restitution to all victims, though she acknowledged most would never recover what they lost. She said his crimes represented a fundamental betrayal of the values that hold communities together. Uncle Lawrence was led away without looking at the gallery where family members cried and victims sat in stunned relief. The aftermath was complicated and painful in ways I had not fully anticipated. Half my extended family cut off contact, viewing me as a traitor who destroyed Uncle Lawrence over business disputes I was too young to understand. Mom struggled with profound cognitive dissonance, loving her brother, but unable to deny the evidence of his crimes. Our relationship became strained and formal, conversations about nothing important, avoiding any mention of the trial or Uncle Lawrence. She sold our house 6 months later and moved across the state, needing distance from the constant reminders. I stayed with my father, who had been divorced from Mom for years, but welcomed me without judgment. He said I had made an impossible choice and handled it with more integrity than most adults would have shown. School was brutal. Everyone knew about the trial from news coverage. Some people called me a snitch. Others avoided me entirely, unsure how to interact with someone involved in such a public catastrophe. A few understood what I had done and why, but they were outnumbered by those who saw only family betrayal. I graduated early and left town immediately, needing to escape the constant weight of recognition and judgment. College in another state offered anonymity and the chance to build an identity separate from being the kid who turned in his uncle. The civil suits took years to resolve. Victims sued Uncle Lawrence's estate, his investors, the complicit title companies, everyone connected to the fraud operation. Most received partial restitution, nowhere near full recovery, but something. Raymond Kowalski got enough to avoid foreclosure and stay in his house until he died 3 years later. His children sent me a letter afterwards saying their father had told them I saved his life by stopping the fraud when I did, that a few more months and he would have been completely ruined beyond recovery. That letter meant more than anything else from the entire ordeal. Mrs. Nguyen received a settlement that allowed her to rent a small apartment, regaining some independence. Marion Fletcher died before the suits concluded, her daughter using the settlement to pay for the memory care facility and establish a fund for elder abuse prevention. Thomas Brennan's children established a foundation in their father's name, focused on educating seniors about financial exploitation. They asked me to speak at their first fundraiser. I declined, not ready to be public about any of it, but I donated anonymously. The foundation grew into a regional resource center, helping hundreds of people recognize and report financial abuse. Knowing something constructive emerged from the tragedy helped slightly. Uncle Lawrence maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. He sent letters to family members claiming he was a political target, a victim of overzealous prosecution, someone who made minor technical errors that were blown out of proportion by an agenda-driven system. Some relatives believed him. Others recognized the letters for what they were, a narcissist, unable to accept responsibility for deliberate cruelty. He filed multiple appeals, all denied. The evidence was too substantial, the testimony too consistent, the pattern too clear. He would serve the full 23 years, unlikely to be released before his mid-70s. Diane received 8 years for her role as an accomplice, serving 5 before parole. She sent me an apology letter during her incarceration, saying she had convinced herself they were helping people access their equity until the trial forced her to confront reality. She said watching victim testimony broke through her rationalizations completely. I never responded to that letter. Some apologies are too late to matter. The corrupt notaries and title company employees received varying sentences, their careers destroyed, their professional licenses revoked permanently. The investors lost millions and faced civil penalties, but avoided criminal charges due to complexity around proving they knew about the fraudulent methods. I think about the case often, turning over questions about complicity and responsibility, and the moment when cooperation becomes participation in evil. I was 16, manipulated, fed lies about business realities. But I also made choices to continue after suspecting something was wrong. The copies I made were motivated partly by self-protection, wanting evidence I was not the mastermind if things collapsed, not purely by moral clarity about stopping harm. My decision to go to the police came only after seeing Marion Fletcher's exploitation, not after the earlier victims I had helped defraud through forged signatures. These facts complicate any simple narrative about heroism or redemption. I carry responsibility for those forged signatures and the harm they enabled. The prosecutor said I was also a victim, manipulated by a trusted family member who exploited my youth and naivety. My therapist says I demonstrated moral courage by choosing to stop the harm despite personal cost. Both things are true simultaneously. I was victimized by Uncle Lawrence's manipulation, and I also victimized others through my participation, however coerced. Living with that complexity never gets easier. What I know with certainty is that silence would have meant more victims. Uncle Lawrence was escalating, growing bolder, targeting more vulnerable people. Marion Fletcher would not have been his last victim. Without intervention, he would have continued destroying lives until he eventually made a mistake that attracted attention. And by then, the victim count would have been far higher. My cooperation with law enforcement stopped active harm, provided evidence for prosecution, offered victims some justice and compensation. Those outcomes matter regardless of my mixed motives or delayed recognition. I also know that the family loyalty Uncle Lawrence weaponized to exploit my free labor was not actually loyalty at all. Real family means protecting each other from harm, not protecting abusers from consequences. The relatives who cut me off after the trial were choosing comfort over conscience, preferring the easy story about good Uncle Lawrence wrongly persecuted over the harder truth about systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. I have no regrets about refusing to provide that comfort by staying silent. If family loyalty requires enabling abuse, then I want nothing to do with that definition of family. And the other victims of Uncle Lawrence's operation deserve mention in any accounting of this story. They were people with names, histories, families, dignity. Raymond Kowalski, who served in Korea. Mrs. Nguyen, who immigrated with 2 suitcases and built a business that put 3 kids through college. Marion Fletcher, who taught elementary school for 40 years. Thomas Brennan, who worked construction and saved every penny to leave something for his children. 43 people targeted specifically because age and isolation made them vulnerable. Their stories matter more than mine. Their suffering was real and devastating, while I collected paychecks and told myself I was learning valuable skills. Some nights I still cannot sleep thinking about the signatures I forged, wondering which specific victims were harmed by documents I falsified, knowing I will never have complete accounting of damage I enabled. Therapy helps, time helps. Knowing that I ultimately chose to stop participating helps, but nothing completely erases the guilt or answers the question of why I did not act sooner. I carry those questions permanently. Maybe that is appropriate. Maybe carrying the weight of choices, good and bad, is what growing up actually means. And Uncle Lawrence inadvertently taught me that real-world lesson, despite himself. 10 years later, I work as a paralegal at a non-profit legal aid organization, helping low-income seniors navigate financial systems and recognize exploitation. The work feels like permanent restitution, never enough but something. I see Uncle Lawrence's methods constantly in the cases we handle, predatory lending and financial manipulation targeting the elderly, and I help stop it before catastrophic harm occurs. My colleagues know my history. I told them during the interview because hiding it felt wrong, and I wanted them to choose me with full information. They said my experience made me uniquely qualified to recognize abuse patterns and understand victim psychology. Most of our clients remind me of Raymond or Mrs. Nguyen, desperate for solutions and vulnerable to anyone offering easy answers. I am careful never to promise more than we can deliver, to explain options clearly, to ensure informed consent for every decision, the opposite of Uncle Lawrence's methods. Mom and I talk occasionally now, brief calls about nothing important, slowly rebuilding something that will never be what it was, but might eventually become its own kind of functional. She has never apologized for choosing to believe Uncle Lawrence initially, and I have never asked her to. Some conversations are too painful to have productively. Uncle Lawrence will be released in 13 years, assuming no additional charges. I do not know if he will contact me or what I would say if he did. Probably nothing. Some people are beyond redemption because they refuse to acknowledge they need it, and watching his trial convinced me Uncle Lawrence is exactly that kind of person. The real world he prepared me for turned out to include recognizing that reality and acting accordingly, though I doubt that was the lesson he intended. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.